Okay. I'm going to share some research with you about language in education policies, and then at the end maybe I'll ask you still and see what you think. Okay. So mother tongue, this is a mouthful, mother tongue based multilingual education, which I will call MTBMLE, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what this is. So it addresses the multilingual education aspect is that it is not just mother tongue. The aim is not for students to be leaving their education only speaking and reading their mother tongue. The aim is for them to use their mother tongue, but also to be proficient and fluent in English and Filipino as well. Okay, so that's the multilingual aspect of it. The mother tongue aspect of it is that they start their education in the mother tongue, okay, and develop a strong foundation in their mother tongue as a way to improve their and build for their other language skills. So they start out with their mother tongue as a base, which helps them learn the additional languages in the future. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So even before this has went through Congress, DepEd had started making this change. So in 2009, there was a DepEd order that was released that called for the institutionalization of MTBMLE. Okay? And it stated the requirements for strong MTBMLE programs. Now, it was submitted, but you could probably ask 90% of teachers if they had heard of it, and they hadn't. But the reason was that I think it, in a way, it was intentional because they wanted to pilot it. So there were, I forget the number off the top of my head, but I think about 390 schools that were piloting from 2009 until 2012, and resources were being developed and such during that time. So it was last year, in 2012, they issued another order, and this offered more specific guidelines for full implementation of this in every school in the country. So it was embedded at that point in the K-12 basic education program. So as part of the K-12, they said grade 1 through 3 students will have their mother tongue. And then, kind of aligning with that, the Enhanced Basic Education Act again reinforced the MTBMLE. Okay, and then so that is what then went to Congress, and Congress has passed that portion of it as well as part of the bigger picture. So here's what it will look like. Kindergarten, mother tongue is a language of instruction for all subjects, and then once they enter grade 1. It remains the language of instruction for a majority of subjects, except Filipino is a separate class, and English is a separate class. But they start building on those skills orally, and then in grade 2, they add on to the oral development and add the literacy components with reading and writing. Okay? But mother tongue is a separate class as well, all throughout elementary school. And so in grade 3, all of these subjects are also in mother tongue, but they begin to bridge it, and they start to bridge those subjects to English and Filipino, so that by the time they reach grade 4, they would be doing full Filipino or English. So my color coding here shows you that all the pink are the classes in English, so math, science, and English. The yellow are all the classes in Filipino, and the blue for all the classes in mother tongue.
Wow.
So the goal is to build a multilingual students. Okay? It's a little bit tricky because in the reconciled bill from the House and the Senate, they are actually suggesting that there should be a transition program that allows mother tongue to be used more in grades 4 through 6 as well. It is not certain how that will actually happen because that was a more recent addition, but it's actually supported quite well, quite heavily in the research as well. So we'll talk about that too. So, as challenging. The topic of mother tongue is a challenge. So there's 12 major languages spoken widely in the Philippines, and these are the 12 languages that were specified in the 2012 DepEd order.
I would like to make some correction, please. Ilocano
Yes.
is not the word that is used, but Ilocano.
Ilocano.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is.
No, actually the Ilocano is a person.
No, because that is also the language. So you always say that the
Ilocano.
language is Ilocano. It should be Ilocano. So Ilocano is not.
You know,
What should the Ilocanos say?
I am an Ilocano.
yeah, you know, and that's
That's called the DepEd defines it.
I'm gonna actually, I have the DepEd orders right here. I think that's how they wrote it in there, and I'm curious.
That's the Department of Education.
Ilocano is persons, but most is
They wrote it as Iloco,
Official.
Ilocano.
The Ilocano's over
but the
here.
Ilocanos would say Ilocano. You know, if I were to do this presentation again, I will change that
No.
Okay.
to represent.
Jay over here teaches in the Philippines. He should know. In fact, Jay De Los Reyes, I forgot to introduce him. He's a student, a master's student at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. He studied with Ditech
He was
for
my
one of her
student.
classes, one of her students in her classes at St. Louis University in Baguio. And his subject for his master's is the education.
K-12.
Oh, nice.
K through 12.
Great.
So is it Iloco or Ilocano? The official.
It's actually, I just recall now because I studied ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines for my first master's. And I can recall that in the lists of the ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines and the languages that they use, according to the listing of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, they actually use Iloco instead of Ilocano.
And even in the Albert Kalangka Awards, literary awards,
Yeah.
there's the Iloco category.
Okay.
And they say that the Ilocanos are the
The people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whenever somebody asks you what do you speak, it's
You say,
Ilocano.
so the popular use of
Yes,
the word.
I think it's more it's more the general way of thinking about it because languages, as you know, evolve.
Right.
So as of I think we always think in terms of the word Ilocano.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna ask. Yeah.
Well, while we're at it, my mother is from Pangasinan, and she speaks
Uh-huh.
Pangasinense. And my grandmother is from Bicol, and they speak Bicolano.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. But they're putting the official codified.
yeah, this is just from the DepEd order, how
Yeah,
they've
so
written it.
it's a
But
little
then you
different
know,
than common
it's-
language.
somehow educators are so out of touch sometimes with reality, and so you know how it is. You know, I am also an academic, but I know I studied.
Yeah. Well, so we have, I appreciate that addition. But we have, the big point here is that there are 12 that are specified. However, do you know how many languages there are in the Philippines?
So many, a lot.
And it depends. It depends how you categorize a language. And there's many ways. I've read many different numbers. There is a source called the Ethnologue. And the way that they have categorized it is they suggest that there are 181 languages.
Indonesia,
Yeah.
oh, look at Indonesia. Wow.
Indonesia is at 722. So seeing a comparison with the rest of Southeast Asia here. What percentage, I'm going to ask you this question, what percentage of the population receives education in their first language?
How do you define first language? Mother tongue?
Their mother tongue.
That's the same as mother tongue, right now?
We'll see, yes, before this policy began.
What percent in the mother tongue?
So how many Tagalog
about
then?
26% had access to education in their first language. So essentially the Tagalog speakers would have access to education in their first language. It's about 26% of the population. With, this will increase now with the mother tongue based policy. That number will go up. Okay. So in comparing the other countries in Southeast Asia, we see that there's a wider range of policies in regards to mother tongue education. There are at the top Brunei, Laos, Myanmar, Burma, and Singapore. There's no explicit policy or practice related to it. Okay, but in terms of Indonesia, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam, there's a policy that allows for it. It says this can happen, but it doesn't really happen. Okay, and then there's Cambodia and Thailand. I probably can't see that. They have some policy support and some action, but the Philippines is the only country in all of Southeast Asia that has strong policy support and some action towards it. And so they really are being looked at as this example throughout Southeast Asia for what is happening. And I'm saying an example in a positive way. I'm not saying it in a negative way.
What is LIE? What is that?
Language in education. I didn't have enough space to write it out.
Language and
Language
education.
in education policy. So what is the policy of the country about how language will be used in schools? But you are probably wondering, well, why do we even use mother tongue? Why, as all of you said, you think English should be used in the schools. Why would we even have this policy? And it goes back a long ways. UNESCO, all the way back into 1953, has said that the use of mother tongue for teaching a child is axiomatic. It's just unquestionable that that is the best way for a child to learn. Okay. More recently, UNICEF has suggested that there's a lot of research that shows that students are quicker to learn how to read, they acquire other academic skills, and they learn second and third and fourth languages more quickly when they first learn in their mother tongue. So I'm going to tell you about some of this research that has been done all over. There are some very strong studies that have been conducted in the United States with Spanish language minority students. But in the Philippines, there was also a study done that was served as the rationale for implementing MTV-MLE. Anybody know where Lubuagan is?
Kalinga.
Yeah, in Kalinga. Are you from Kalinga? And so Lubuagan, have you heard about the program they are doing there?
I heard it from my aunt who is Dr. Gloria Bonilla. She's actually into that.
Okay. Yes, so Lubuagan is being highlighted all over the Philippines for the work that they are doing. And back in 1999, they started a small pilot program with some schools to pilot a mother tongue-based approach. And so the community came together to develop their language, to write their orthography, so they were developing what it would look like. It was not a written language. Prior to that, they developed materials. They created a very culturally relevant materials, so related to their heritage. They were involved in the decision-making process of it. So everybody came together to experiment, but it took many years for people to be convinced that they should do this, okay? And so it was a lot of advocacy, a lot of explaining. Finally, a couple teachers agreed that they would try it, and they did have DepEd support to do this. So they have since then done a longitudinal study to compare, it was a small study, but they had 3 experimental schools and 3 control schools. So the experimental schools were using mother tongue, and the control schools were using the bilingual English and Filipino as their subjects. So at the end of each year, they gave the students their assessments, and in terms of a reading assessment, you can see the blue is the control and the green is the experimental. In grade 1, the experimental had 75% correct on the test, and the control had 52%. So the control group took this test in English, because that was their language of instruction, for reading, and the experimental group took it in Lilibuagan, was their language, and so they took it in that, because it was an assessment of how well they could read. And you can see that the same result shows throughout grade 2 and 3 as well. In math assessment, the same thing was observed. students that learned in Lilibuagan were able to perform higher on their math assessment, which was in Lilibuagan, than the students in the other school who had an English math assessment. And then Filipino. So this class was conducted in Filipino in both schools, and the assessment was in Filipino, of course. And so the experimental schools still did better, and English, they still did better, even though they did not have the language of instruction as English throughout the rest of the day. Okay. Now, I will say that these sample sizes, like, that's what this N means. The N means how many students were in each of the groups. For a study of this nature, they're very small. Okay? And so we have to be a little cautious in interpreting the results. However, the man that did this study is also doing a larger study of this nature in Cameroon, and they have 12 experimental schools and 12 control schools, and the differences between the groups are even more. And so this result is being seen all over the world in terms of for language minority students. And so this is an analogy that I have often seen, that building the foundation in your L1, or your first language, it builds a foundation for students to cross over that bridge in order to build a foundation in their second and third languages. Other benefits in the literature, in the research, suggest that a mother tongue-based approach leads to stronger classroom participation. There is increased access to education because a lot of students drop out, and some of the reasons why they drop out is that because they're not understanding what is going on in the classroom. So a mother tongue approach would lead to more students attending school. Development of critical thinking skills. When you can think in your own language, you can think more critically and problem solve more. Stronger cultural pride. There are also studies that suggest the parent involvement goes up because the parents speak the same language as the school language. Okay, so these are results that are a conglomerate from the whole world, so not just specific to the Philippines. So, clearly MTV-MLE is the best approach, right? Or is it?
Yeah, that's the question. What's the final result?
Well, if it was only about, if you had a perfect environment where you had all the resources you needed and the support of the community, I believe that MTV-MLE is the best approach. But there's a lot of factors involved, and so we'll talk about some of the challenges. So in a MTB, or in a mother tongue-based approach, can you read this from the back?
Yes.
There are many things that need to be considered, not just what is the language of instruction. You cannot just change the language of instruction and think that the education quality will go up. There have to be a lot of components. And some of them that I highlighted are training staff. The teachers that I met with last summer, they found out about MTV-MLE 1 week before the start of the school year. And it was problematic because they were frantic. So the school year started in June. I was there at the end of June, so they only knew about it for 1 month when I met with them. And they said, we have to change the whole way that we teach. These were only grade 1 teachers, but we have to change everything, and we only had 5 days to prepare for it. So training, and so their training was very basic about just essentially how do you survive, because it was a big shift. The graded reading materials is another challenge that they're struggling with. Particularly if you think about their math textbooks, they're all in English. And so many of the teachers said, my math textbooks are sitting on the bookshelf. I have not opened them the entire year. And so they have had to create their own resources that are in the mother tongue because they have not been provided for them. And so one teacher estimated that she now spends 16 hours more per week preparing for her class. 16 hours more is a lot of extra time and she was already probably spending a lot of time. And then it's also about informed and engaged partners, and I'll blend that with community ownership. Because I talked about in the Luguagan study about how the community they were involved as decision makers, and they were involved in creating materials and supporting the program. That has not happened largely because the approach in the Philippines has been from a national level, top down, rather than more at the bottom up or ground level approach. So most of the studies that have been done in these communities where there is a community-based program, like Luguagan or the Cameroon study. We don't know a whole lot about what happens when it is a top-down policy or when the national level is mandating this to occur. Okay? Very few countries have adopted a rigorous top-down policy, Bolivia and South Africa, but they've struggled for implementation. And so they smile. It's probably not the best picture. So they have struggled. So the Philippines has an opportunity here in order to show what happens when there is this national approach. But it's going to involve a lot of effort from the communities, and I think that's where their efforts need to be targeted. So I'm just going to give you a little snapshot of the research that I did so you can see teachers and parents' perspectives of what is happening. Okay? And so I lived in the Bicol region. I lived in Catanduanes for 2 years, from 2003 to 2005. And when I was there, I was fascinated by the languages that were used in the schools, which is why I started to research this. But in my study, I talked to teachers and parents of grade 1 students because I wanted to know how they understood the policy and how they supported it, and what they did to support it or not support it. So just a little snapshot, teachers and parents' views of the benefits. I was actually very surprised at their responses, because I thought 1 month into implementation, I thought they're not going to like this at all. And they had a lot of frustrations. But when I asked them what they saw happening, they were really excited about the fact that their students understood everything they were saying. And the students were participating. And they were thinking more critically, not just the recall or just not the rote memorization. And I also observed in many classrooms, and I saw the difference too. I was watching in some Filipino classes versus mother tongue classes, and the students were much more participatory. They were always eager, but there was a difference in the mother tongue classes. The types of responses that they were giving were much deeper than just the reciting. And so I was surprised by it, but the parents and the teachers were very enthusiastic that this was happening. And I will just also give the disclaimer, this is one community. I cannot say that this happens all over, but in my research in this one place, that's what I observed. So when they talked about the disadvantages of the policy, they separated themselves from the benefits that they saw. Even though they knew that the research had suggested that English learning would not be sacrificed, they still were worried about what is going to happen to English. So there's such a deeply held ideology favoring English that and even though they had been told, here's what the research suggests, they still were very, very concerned. And so oftentimes parents and teachers would say, well, this is okay for grade 1, but past grade 1, I don't know. I don't think we should do it. Or they would say, well, this is okay for the low ability students, but for those students that can speak English, I think we need to let them do that.
Colonial mentality?
I'm sorry?
Colonial mentality?
Yeah, that definitely it plays into it, sure. So some of the challenges, as you could probably guess, are the lack of materials, as I suggested with the math textbooks sitting. They're the teachers are working very tirelessly to create materials for each day. The academic language came up a lot. I had teachers laughing a lot, saying, I don't know how to say exponent in Bicol, or how do you say ratio, or place, like we just don't know how to say that. And the numbers, they said in math class, they said our students know how to count in English, but now we have to use our mother tongue to count. And so it was very humorous, actually. I was observing in a class, and the students were supposed to count out their objects in Bicol, or Bicolano. I always said Bicol. In Bicol. But what they would do is they counted in English, but then they translated their answer to Bicol and gave their answer in Bicol to the teacher.
I have some kind of comment on that. If you will look at the English language, actually, ratio, for example, might be, I don't know, Greek or Latin. And all the numbers that we have are actually a Romance language. So what's wrong if the Filipinos use the English language because it's an adaptation?
Well,
I don't find anything wrong with that. So.
And that's their argument. That is the teacher's argument, saying, well, does it matter if can't we use the terminology in English if it is better? Science and math are the hardest to translate into a local language. And
that's actually my experience with my grandson right now. He is here, and we are trying to teach him. We try to teach him Filipino. But then when he asks me some technical question in science, I have to speak to him in English. That's just it.
Right. So that is the challenge, though, that they are facing, because they are being told that they have to do it in the local language. And so I have asked them, what do you do? And they said, we have no choice. We use it in English. Numbers they try to do, but it's very long. And so the students have trouble. And many of the students do not even know the Bicol words in the numbers.
I do just a comment about that. I know that there are government pages where you can request the Tagalog version of a U.S. official document. And there are a lot of English words sprinkled in there, even though it's supposedly for the Filipinos who speak Tagalog. So
it's a very interesting context, because one day I made a note to myself. I was standing on the side of the road waiting for a tricycle to come to give me a ride back into town. And I was standing there listening to the children on the playground. They were all talking in Bicol. I heard a soap opera coming from a house near me, and that was in Tagalog. And I looked at all the signs on the street, and they were all in English. And the Philippines is such a multilingual society that it is very challenging to try to isolate.
That they call that Creole, actually. It's like a Creole.
Sure.
So it's like a merger of two different languages. And why not? There's nothing wrong with that.